everybody, and welcome to another episode of JTV. Today, I'm extremely excited and honored to be joined by Rabbi Joseph Dweck, who is the senior rabbi of the S&P Sephardi community in the UK. And I'm particularly thrilled to have him on today because I so deeply value his deep thinking, his sensitive insights into Torah, which has come from a very long time of study, and also because he's a wonderful mentor and a friend to me. So Rabbi, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule in America at the moment, because you're currently across the pond, and thank you for joining us here today.
Ollie, it's an honor and pleasure, really an honor. Thanks for having me.
And also we have to mention that you've just started up a new podcast called Humans Being, right?
Yes, I have. We actually did 6 episodes for our first season, which, yeah, I'm very excited about. Thanks for mentioning.
Fantastic. And that's available across all the main podcast platforms, I assume. So we were just talking just before this about the topic of ego, and that it's part of the work of life that Judaism demands of us or asks of us is to try and get rid of our ego, let our ego get out of the way. And what I mean by ego is, focusing on, I guess, an overly sensitive kind of self consciousness and self-concern. And we were talking about what are the options for getting rid of the ego. Do you just stop focusing on yourself? But then what about you? And so you were saying that there's a difference between ego and self. And can you talk a bit about that, what you mean by that, and how do we navigate these two things?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. We can speak about it from various paradigms. In Judaism, the ego is seen as what Chazal would normally call the Yetzer Hara, or the drive for creativity that is centered towards counterproductivity or evil or negative things, because it's coming from within, right? I mean, these are things that are coming from within, and the creative drives that we have can be used for either positive or negative things. When we talk about me, right, who I am, we often get confused between what I would term, just to be able to differentiate it in our language, the ego and the self. And what I mean by that is that the ego is essentially based in fear and shame. And what that means is that the ego is always concerned that it is either in threat or not valuable or worthwhile. And so there's always something that's going to happen to, something that one needs to protect from, something that one needs to be concerned about in terms of one's very being in life. And so we do all manner of things in order to be able to address those tremendously uncomfortable feelings of fear and shame. And we do everything from fighting, from fleeing, from numbing, with all sorts of things. And what happens when we do that is that the self, which is essentially the wholeness of a person's sense of integrated, whole, meaningful, thoughtful, content, peaceful existence in this world, right? When we are just happy to be, that is always at threat when the ego is in control. And because the ego is survive-oriented, it has a tremendous amount of power, and it has veto power in our brains to be able to assert itself and to say, we're in trouble, we've got to do this. And sometimes it happens, because it's a very old part of our brain. I mean, biological psychologists will talk about it manifesting in the amygdala or in the limbic system of the brain, which is a very old structure of the brain. It develops first. It's shared across animal species, even down to the reptilian. So sometimes it's called the lizard brain. It's a very old aspect of the brain. Chazal actually say that the Yetzer Hara is a melech zaken. It's an old king, uchsil, but not a very intelligent one, right? It's not really planning and thinking and strategizing. It's just responding to whatever is in the moment.
And it's very old.
Whereas when it comes to the self, Chazal say, they talk about being sameach bechelko, right? Being happy, not being okay with, being happy with one's lot, or the space of life that one has, right? So that's not necessarily the assets that I have or the talents that I have, but simply my very being, my existence, my life, being happy with what I am and how I am.
But what is your life other than the things, the people around you, the things around you, and of course the things you bring to it? But how do you differentiate between experience and self? You know what I mean?
So those things that you say, this people around you and the interactions, those are all very important to life, but they're secondary to your own being. It's important for people to be able to come to a certain level in life. And I say certain level because there are levels of this, right? There is constant growth that we are engaging in life as long as we are alive, but to a level in which we are accepting of the value and reality of ourselves. And for so many of us, there are parts of ourselves as we grow and develop in this world that we are uncomfortable, not necessarily consciously, it could be unconscious, but that we're uncomfortable embracing, we're uncomfortable even looking at. And so our brains also have a tendency to hide things from us, right, from our consciousness about ourselves. And we get very touchy when people might criticize aspects of things that kind of poke at those elements of self. But what Chazal prompt us to do, Hillel HaZaken was, very much spoke about the importance of being able to hold oneself in high value. When he says, if I'm not going to do for me, who's going to do for me? Or when he talks about, the Simchat Bet HaShoeva at Sukkot, where there was this great celebration that only the Chachamim participated in, he would say, Ani kan, hakol kan. If I am here, everything is here. To be able to say that without hubris, to be able to simply say that as matter of fact, of recognizing I am in my wholeness, in all of the aspects and complexities of my person, because the reality is, Ollie, I'm sure that you would agree that human beings are quite complex. There's a lot going on inside us. There is very many aspects. You don't agree? I think there's a lot going on inside us. And part of life is being able to, first of all, recognize what it is that's going on inside, what elements of self there are. And secondly, how to integrate those into a whole, meaningful, consistent identity or being. And that is, for all intents and purposes, the work of our lives. It's the same reason why the first word of God to creation is simply Yehi, be. And that's all HaKadosh Baruch Hu all God really ever asks us to do. When the first words that God says to Abraham, to Abraham Avinu, are Lech Lecha, go for you, Abraham. Rashi insists that we make sure not to read that in any other way, not for anybody else. So Rashi says, Lecha letovatcha lehanaatcha, for your good, for your enjoyment, for your life, Abraham. You need to do this for you because God's not going to do that for us. God's put us in here to be able to create ourselves, to develop ourselves. Of course, he helps. There's, like you were saying at the very beginning, there are times where we feel touched and graced by God's involvement in our life. But to make us into us is our job. So that element of self, that element of wholeness, of I am, and being able to say that in full confidence and strength, without fear, without shame, that is the work of our lives. Ego is always afraid and very often shameful. And so we struggle to try, and there are people that can't get around that, right? And we find ourselves sometimes in life where we have trouble getting around that.
Does the ego itself feel shame, or the ego makes the self feel shame?
I don't know that there's necessarily a considerable difference between the two. The reality is that in the place of ego, or from what it is that we call ego in the vernacular, Freud might have termed ego a touch different than we do in the general vernacular. By ego, I mean the concerned element of me, of my being, and where I have to protect my life against threat, right? That's the essential element of ego. Yes, there is shame involved in that. Whether it's coming from it or it's projecting or however it is that it manifests, the bottom line is that it feels inadequate. It feels less than. It feels missing. It experiences lack that others might have, or it experiences something that I am not able to present or manifest in life. And that runs together with fear, back and forth. Shame and fear are wonderful bedfellows because they work on each other constantly. And the job of our life is to be able to emerge out of that, to heal those things, and to be able to hold the wholeness of self. Because if you think about it, Ollie, from a Jewish perspective, right? From a Jewish perspective, where God is involved in this, God created us. So for me to feel that I am inadequate or less than or lacking value is essentially to say that God messed up. And there's an element of blasphemy in that. There's a beautiful story, if I can share, it's very, very short, that I always mention. It's in Masechet Ta'anit, and where there was Chazal say that, one of the Hachamim had just come from studying with his Rav, and his mind was on the lofty heavens of intellectual grandeur. And he just felt that he was kind of king of the world. And as he's riding, there is a very ugly man. That's what the Gemara says, that comes up by his side. And in his intellectual mind, he turns to this man, the rabbi, and he says, "Are all of the people in the village you come from as ugly as you?" And you would think, like, how could the Rav say such an insensitive and callous thing? And that's to be dealt with in the sugya. But what the man responds is extremely telling. The man, without missing a beat, turns to the rabbi and says, "I don't know. Why don't you ask the one who made me?" And immediately the Rav recognizes that he sinned in even suggesting that there was deficiency. And so for us, it's important for us to remember that Torah teaches us, Judaism teaches us in the very opening elements of the Bible, of the Torah, that talk about the creation of man, that the life spirit in us is the breath of God. And that's something that we are meant to embrace and internalize genuinely. And if this is what it is that we are, if the breath of God is the life force in us, then we really do need to be able to exorcise the fear and shame that completely inhibits us from being able to live that way.
Yeah. Isn't the truth, though, that a part of us actually, well, a big part of us, I don't know whether it's the ego itself that's doing this to us, but a part of us doesn't want to let go of the ego because, we feel like it's, as you say, protecting us and all that kind of thing. And also we feel that it's a huge part of us isn't even aware of it, and it's telling us it's acting in our best interests, right? And so,
of course it is.
Yeah.
But that's the tactic of the ego.
Right, exactly. But
I mean, it's a wonderful tactic when to say you can't afford to let me go.
Yeah.
Is also a way to completely cripple a human being.
Yeah.
And so the more that we play into that fear, the more we give ourselves over to that bondage of ego. And it really is a form of bondage. It's one of the reasons why there's, people struggle with addiction so much. And part of the struggle of addiction is this feeling that you cannot let me go. If you let me go, whatever it is that the addiction is, if you let me go, the world falls apart. You are nothing. And we all have that on some level or another. The greatest ones among us have managed in their lives to be able to quiet that down tremendously and to live from a place of whole self. But I can say to you, Ollie, not just from an academic perspective, but from personal experience on whatever level. I mean, I still struggle like everyone else does with my ego. I'm not coming at you in any way, shape, or form to say I've got it. But I can say that at 46, I am not the same as I was at 26, and that I've learned more about myself with the capital S. And in terms of that, one does come to an awareness in which the letting go of the ego is itself liberation and freedom to be able to be oneself.
Is there something you are sacrificing, though? Is there something that's been lost as a result of letting go of the ego?
The only thing that's been lost are chains. Genuinely, when one is able to emerge beyond that. Look, the ego is part of us.
No, but what I'm saying is that there's certain pleasures you know, you know, kina kavod taiva, you know, like there's certain pleasures that when achieved, the ego rejoices in, and there's some of those things are lost, right, as a result of letting go.
I'm not sure. I mean, those three that you mentioned, kina, tava, and kavod, you know that the Mishnah, the Pirkei Avot says that those three things, which literally mean honor, desire, and jealousy.
What I mean is when those things are achieved, let's say desire.
It wasn't what you mean by achieve. I'm not sure what it is that you mean.
Experience.
Because in my experience, those things, like Chazal say, they say that those three things pull a person out of the world. They remove a person from life because they become so self-absorbed and self-centered, which essentially is another way of saying egocentric. Yeah, that they shut a person down from being able to live. So the honor, if I do not simply know that my weight, literally is what kavod means. Kavod comes from kaved. There is a weightiness of my own existence. If I don't know that there is a natural weightiness to my own existence, then no matter how much I look for it from the outside, it will never satisfy.
Yeah.
If I don't know that the experience of life in terms of ta'ava, in terms of my desire for things, if I'm looking for things in order to be able to fill void in me, which so many of us do, it will never be filled. And I will constantly be looking.
Right, but what I'm saying is when the one thing that is lost when you remove the chains of ego is those quick hits that never last, but the quick hit pleasures of desire or honor.
Right. But when one does recognizes that I don't even want those anymore. They don't, because they're quick fixes, because they do not last, because they do not fill a weighty element of real self, they are wastes of time.
Yeah.
And when one is in the state of ego, one can't even relate that they're wastes of time because one can't imagine surviving without them because the pain is too great. The shame is too great to bear. That's the genuine truth.
Yeah. So
the whole of Torah prompts us towards loving whole self, all of it. And that's the genuine endeavor of our lives. And the main reason for that is because when we can get there, we can actually have full, loving, meaningful, healthy relationships. And then that means that we can actually have that with God. And until we can have loving, whole, healthy relationships with people, we cannot have them with God. People believe that they can.
I heard a rabbi say that when we talk about self-esteem, you know, high self-esteem, low self-esteem, he said part of the problem with that is too much focus on self. And so, you know, if you focus on low self-esteem, oh, I'm nothing, you're crippled because you're focused too much. In either case, you're focusing so much on yourself. What's the balance between, you know, having a healthy love of self, but also not being, you know, immersed in the self that you can't actually look outwards? I mean, do you think he has a point about there's something overly self-indulgent, even though most people that have low self-esteem, well, everyone is really is a victim, has suffered, experiences that because of things that have happened to them, right? But to what extent do you think he actually, this is a good point, that just part of the getting rid of the shackles of ego and self-esteem issues is by less focus on self?
So I'll say this, I still think it's important to be able to use the different terms, ego and self. And it sounds to me like what that rabbi is trying to say is that if you are looking at yourself in terms of worry, do I have enough self-esteem? Am I too low self-esteem? And so on and so forth. That's all ego. It's all a matter of, oh no, am I okay?
Yeah.
And that worry is entirely egocentric.
Yeah.
It's entirely a question of, am I okay? What has to happen is we begin from the I am okay. Why? Elohai neshama shenatata bi tehora. So first things, according to Chazal, before Modeh Ani was written, Modeh Ani is only 500 years old. The first thing that we were meant to say in the morning was that, my Lord, the soul you have blown into me, right, that you have given of your breath into me is pure. That's meant to be the first thing that we say every day. So when I come from that axiom, right, that base truth, the first thing is I am pure. I am okay. Are there things that I need to address about myself? Perhaps. Are there things that I want to grow into? Yes. Are there elements of myself that I'd like to develop? Yes. All of that is fine, but I don't feel that I am inadequate as I am before God. And that is a shift that must happen. So it's not a matter of do I focus on myself enough or not. It's a question is, think of it in terms of taking care of a child, right? Because we don't think about worrying about ourselves. I shouldn't use worrying as a term, but mean in the sense of taking care, right? Giving care to ourselves. We must care for ourselves regularly.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we fall apart. So if I think about it in terms of a child, is there, do I think about the fact that if I need to think, how do I feed this child? Make sure that this child sleeps well. This child is clothed. This child is loved. This child is embraced. This child is played with. This child has encouragement. All of the elements that go into raising a strong, robust, healthy child go into maintaining and holding a human being's life always. And so if it isn't too much to think about in terms of that child, it's not too much to think about in terms of ourselves. Should I not be thinking about, am I eating well? Am I sleeping well? Am I having enough play in my life? Because that's part of human experience. Am I having enough interaction, social stimulation in my life? Am I thinking enough in my life? All of those questions are extremely important, meaningful, fundamental questions to a healthy human existence. So if we think, oh no, I'm thinking about myself too much, well, then that's a failure if it's in those terms. If it's a sitting of worry, am I enough? Am I not enough? Will people like me or not like me? That, unfortunately, is a difficult mind loop that we get ourselves into that wastes our time. Because the given should be, of course you are enough and worthy. Your life force is the breath of God, nothing less. Start there and build. And then, of course, it's like I mentioned, Hillel HaZaken. He was the major teacher of this. So there's a beautiful story in the Talmud that says that Hillel HaZaken was running through the streets and his students are running after him. And the students say, Rabbeinu, where are you going? And he says, I'm going to do a huge mitzvah. And they say, what are you doing? He goes, I'm going to take a bath. They say, what are you talking about? They said, well, I'll ask you. I mean, if the king gave you an image in his likeness, would you not keep that in a good, prominent place in your home and shine it and keep it clean all the time? You never know when the king might be coming and so on. Well, it says that God created us in his image. I'm going to take care of that. I take that seriously, says Hillel HaZaken.
Yeah, but
the reality is that so many of us don't take that seriously.
But he's right. But he's doing that self-care, not for him. It's for God.
He's doing it for his own betterment because he recognizes this relationship that he has with God. He holds himself of high esteem because he is essentially from God.
Right, but the point is, it's not about him. It's about...
It is about him. Of course it's about him, because the whole beauty is the fact that he was created.
Right.
That's the whole point of it. You are an absolutely unique individual. And that's something you need to love and embrace.
Mm-hmm. And
anything that cuts away at that is counterproductive.
And what do we do about, we talk, one of the issues with the ego is self-image and self-worth. What about the issue of just the ego resists things when things aren't going your way, or you want more of this or that in your life and you're not getting it? And, you talk about looking after yourself and self-care, and do I have enough of, this in my life? Have I spent enough time doing? But sometimes those things, those options are taken away, right? And so then the question is, the ego then screams, no, it shouldn't be this way. And that's a lot of, I think, a huge amount of anxiety people have today. As my life has to be, especially in the world of Instagram and Facebook, where everyone posts their perfect lives that are actually not perfect. How do we deal with that part of the ego, which says, needs to be this way, but God's like, actually, it's not going to be that way.
Look, I think it's important to say that the ego is within us for good reasons. right? There are things that it does do that are valuable. And it is. There are times where I need to fight for myself. There are times where I need to fly from dangerous situations. And the ego is what helps me do that, right? But it is also important to recognize that there are different stages of life. In some situations, we are either surviving, and in other situations, we are thriving. We can either survive or thrive. And in some circumstances, we don't have the choice. Sometimes we are forced into a situation and where we have to now just survive, which means that we will not thrive. And if that is the case, then so be it. We have to accept that that is what the circumstance is. None of those situations should bring us to a point in which we feel that we are not, by our very existence, worthy and whole. And the ego will tell us, if you don't have this, you're nothing. That's the tactic. And we believe that, hook, line, and sinker. What one has to recognize is that at the end of the day, there is nothing external to oneself that completely defines oneself.
Right.
There are many enhancing things. There are many things that help us, that make us thrive. But at the end of the day, the self exists only within us and nothing else. And one can be, chas v'shalom, stripped of every last element of life, except for the life itself. And one is able to come through and rebuild if one is able to recognize that one doesn't define oneself by external entities. That's very much about the book of Job is about, right? The book of Eov is about, to present those ideas to us.
Well, as you mentioned biblical characters, I was just about to say, one of our shared favorite biblical characters being Joseph, and you talk about surviving versus thriving. Isn't part of what we learn from him that even though he goes through some shameful, painful experiences, didn't he seem to thrive even when he was in prison? I mean, maybe thrive is the wrong word, but would you say Joseph was just surviving in those difficult circumstances? Or was it, because I feel like the language of the biblical commentaries is that I don't know if thrive is the right word, but he rose to the occasion, right?
Well, I think that Yosef first of all, Yosef, I mean, I always like to point out that the narrative of the biographical treatment of Joseph's life is the longest biographical narrative in the Torah. So it's extremely significant, his life. And it's there to definitely teach us some major fundamentals about how it is that we live. And what we find from Yosef are two aspects of his life. There are times where we see him just surviving, and there are times where we see him thriving. There are times where we see him thrown in jail, and where he genuinely believes that his life is, for all intents and purposes, over and completely restricted. And then there's times where he's the viceroy, his father and the whole of his family is living with him in Egypt. He's rolling, as we would say. He's doing it phenomenally. And it's important that we see him in both of those circumstances, because I do believe that Yosef definitely is a model for us of strong self, of being able to be very confident in one's own self and bank on that, completely. And we see that even in the situations of survival, one of the major elements that Yosef does not compromise is his integrity, because he recognizes that in any given situation, the one consistent element is his self. It's always Yosef. It's either Yosef in jail, Yosef in the house of Potiphar, Yosef as viceroy of Egypt. Whatever it is that he's doing, he does it to his very best, because he recognizes that that is the only non-variable. And no matter where it is that he finds himself, because think about it, Ollie, this is an important thing to think about that I think that people don't always have a consciousness of. Human beings, because of the nature of of the freedom of our thought, right, at least in our understanding, our experience of it, we all have any number of innumerable lives that we can lead. In other words, there's nothing stopping either you or me or anyone else from picking up, moving to another city, country, choosing to do something else. Right? There's nothing that's stopping us from doing any of those things. It may be unreasonable for us to do those things. It may be that there are certain trappings that keep us in line from doing these things. But the bottom line is there is nothing really stopping any one of us from simply saying, I'm doing something else. I'm moving somewhere else, changing my name to something else, engaging in other behaviors completely. There's nothing that stops us from doing that. And that means, Ollie, that that the life that we actually end up living is a sampling. It's a sample of the various lives that we possibly could live. And the only thing that is constant in any one of those lives is me. The one thing that is consistent is whatever it is that I choose, it'll be me doing it. So as far as Yosef was concerned, it didn't matter whether he was in jail or viceroy of Egypt. He needed to do it with the greatest of integrity and the best self that he could be. And he did. That's one of the things that the Torah keeps telling us about his stations, that whatever it was that he was doing, he rose to the top. And was successful because he dedicated himself completely faithfully in just being in it in the best way he could, rather than trying to figure out how he could finagle his way to protect himself, to move his situation, manipulate the people around him, and so on.
So is it wrong to use the word that he thrived in prison? Or that maybe his...
I don't think that he was thriving in prison. I think he was surviving in prison, but he was surviving entirely as himself, faithful to himself from an integrity that was clear. I think he was thriving towards the end of his time as viceroy, and we see that.
Right.
He was on top of the world, literally.
Yeah.
You know, so we get to see him in those various stages, but the one constant was his faithfulness to his identity and to his integrity. That was not compromised.
Absolutely.